Part 4. Across the Rockies. Down the carved hills the bison come, to the cool wet buffalo wallows. The monstrous bulls with dripping mane splash through the river shallows. In the bottomlands the elk herd stands, and crops the flower-strewn grass. By rushes rank along the bank, white swans swim slowly past. Across the Bitterroot Mountains, from Lolo Creek to the Kooskooskee River, September 15th to October 7th, 1805. The expedition was through with tow ropes and pole pushing. They now had 29 horses for transportation through some of the roughest country in North America. The pack saddles were tightly cinched and the baggage carefully secured. The procession slowly piled up the slopes toward the snow-clad peaks that cut sharply against green sky and long jagged ranges. They pushed through the thick brush and scrambled up steep slopes that became almost perpendicular walls. Sometimes a horse would slip and fall, rolling down the mountainside with his precious pack to be hauled up again onto the rough trail. As they camped for the night, a cold rain turned to snow and then became sleet. Next morning they thawed out the frozen baggage and urged the weary horses over the steep snow-covered ridges. Slipping and scrambling down a rocky mountainside, the explorers landed in a valley where they came upon an Indian encampment. The Indians welcomed them by throwing their buffalo robes about their shoulders and willingly shared with them their own meager supplies of roots and berries. These Indians, who called themselves the Ootlashoots, were a tribe of the Tushipa Nation, and like most tribes of the western slopes, they were on their way east to the Three Forks of the Missouri and the Buffalo. The tribe owned a herd of 500 superb horses. There were speeches and presents and horse trading. The captains obtained 13 fine horses from these Indians. The expedition followed a rocky creek down a pine-clad valley and camped by a pleasant stream which they called Traveler's Rest. That evening Coulter came back from the hunt with 3 Indians. They were Flatheads and were in pursuit of 2 Shoshones who had stolen 25 of their horses. The Indians were given food and presents and invited to go with the party as guides, but they were close on the trail of their quarry and slipped off into the dark forest like pursuing wolves. Farther on, the party came upon springs of boiling hot water that gushed out of the rocks. Here the deer and elk had worn trails, and the Indians had dug up a pit for a steam bath. Foot by foot they fought their way through the tangles of fallen timber and urged the crippled and jaded horses over the shoulders of bleak ridges. In the snowdrifts along the mountain tops for a while they lost the trail. Night after night the hunters came back empty-handed. The exhausted men shivered around the campfire, warming their half-frozen feet, and drank thin, portable soup that Lewis had bought in Philadelphia. When the last of the corn and flour was gone, they killed and ate a colt. On the savage peaks that towered about them, it seemed that no living thing had existed for countless ages. Gaunt with hunger and weak with fatigue, the men grimly struggled on. They killed and devoured another colt and lived. Again the captains decided to separate as they had done in former emergencies. Clark, with 6 hunters, rode ahead, blazing the trail for Lewis to follow. As Clark's party advanced over the mountains, the going became rougher. In a wild valley they shot a lone horse. That night the men gorged on horse steaks and left the rest of the carcass hung on a tree for Lewis's party to find. From a high ridge, Clark could glimpse a broad plain far to the west. With renewed hope they tackled the intervening ridges. Along the precipices, down ravines and creek bottoms, they struggled on through the foothills and out onto the plain. They were over the Rockies at last. Clark's party had come down into the warm air of a plain that stretched westward. They hoped to find a way across this plain to the Columbia, the great waterway to the sea. Clark surprised 3 little Indian boys hiding in the grass and sent them off with presents to the nearby camp of their tribe. Soon the party was surrounded by crowds of wondering Indians who fed the starved men with dried salmon and roots. Clark went in search of their chief, Twisted Hair, who had gone down the river on a fishing trip. Lewis and his gaunt men followed Clark's trail blazes across the savage wilderness. They found and feasted on the horse meat Clark had left for them and rejoiced at the distant vision of the comforting plains. At last they struggled down through the tangled timber of the foothills to be met by the enervating warmth of the plains and the excited welcome of the Indians. Lewis found Clark studying a map of the Columbia, which Twisted Hair had drawn for him on an antelope skin. The captains at once began to make their plans for reaching the river. The Indians who swarmed out to marvel at the strangers from over the mountains were the Chapunish, or Pierced Noses. The squaws brought baskets of quamash roots and dried salmon, and the famished men overstuffed themselves with this unfamiliar food. Many were soon laid up with horrible bellyaches, and the heat of the plains after the cold and fatigue of the mountains seemed to drain the last of their strength. After a few days' rest, they began slowly to recover. Their axemen felled 5 tall arborvitae trees and hollowed them out with fire and scrapers, Indian fashion, into dugout canoes. The men branded their 38 horses and gave them in trust to Twisted Hair till their return. Their saddles were cached near the river. On October 7th, they embarked in the 5 canoes on a stream which led to a river the Indians called the Kuskuski. This stream, the Indians said, would take them to the Columbia. Down the Columbia, October 7th to 17th, 1805. The expedition was on the way again and the men in high spirits. This is going to be easy, thought Sergeant Pat Gass as he shoved off in the last canoe. They were rivermen again, headed downstream to join the Columbia in the 5 canoes loaded with their precious baggage, instruments, and ammunition. They had been so used to fighting upstream and climbing over mountains that the first rapids of the racing Kuskuski came as a surprise, even though Twisted Hair had pointed out such things on his map. A dozen times a day they came to places where the river rushed in wild swirls of foaming water down stream beds filled with hidden rocks. The canoes raced through the boiling lather of white spray and came out safely into smooth water. There were places where the torrent was so violent that the captains and Cruzat went ahead to study the current and to plan their course through the racing chutes. Those who couldn't swim were put ashore, along with the most valuable baggage, which they packed on their backs. They were to join the canoes at the foot of the rapids. Sometimes the canoe hit a rock, tearing a hole in her bottom. The crew scrambled out on the rocks. Whatever floated was salvaged by the canoes downstream. There were many halts for repairs and drying out luggage. The expedition reached the fabulous Columbia at last, and the canoes pushed out into its broad current. 20 feet down through the clear water they could see the armies of great silver salmon coming up from the distant sea to spawn their eggs in the very spot where they had been hatched. The tribes along the river caught the great fish and split and hung them on drying racks. Their flesh was then pounded into flakes, made into cakes, and packed neatly in baskets. These were buried, and in this way the fish would keep sweet for several years. What the buffalo was to the Plains Indians, the salmon was to the Columbia tribes. The treeless shores of the Columbia were bare of game. Instead of tender elk's tongue and buffalo hump of the Missouri, the companions now gagged on a tasteless diet of fish and roots. Once, when they went ashore to purchase food from the Indians, 2 Frenchmen in the party with more adventurous appetites bought and ate a couple of Indian dogs. Other members of the party joined the dog eaters' feast until as many as 40 Indian poodles were bought for the pot at one deal. Only Captain Clark disdained this delicacy. They were now passing through the country of the Sokol Nation. These Indians were friendly and peaceable. The women were short and fat, and their heads were flattened in such a manner that the forehead made a straight line from the nose to the crown of the head. A board was strapped over the babies' heads so that this deformity was brought about painlessly as they grew. 2 friendly Choponish chiefs, Twisted Hair and Tito, had joined the party. As they pushed on down the Columbia, these chiefs went ashore and made friends with the river tribes. The canoes were now making 30 to 40 miles a day down the river toward the great falls of the Columbia. Men from the clouds. Clark quickly brought his rifle to his shoulder as the crane spread its great wings and rose from the opposite shore. There was a sharp report, a puff of smoke, and the bird fell with a heavy splash into the water. It would be sent to the president as a specimen. Clark was waiting for the 4 canoes to come down the river. As his canoe crossed the stream to pick up the bird, 6 Indians suddenly appeared along the shore. In a few moments they disappeared into the bushes. Clark could see the huts of an Indian village near the river. "Let us stop and smoke the peace pipe with them and let them know that more white strangers are coming," said Drewer. As the party came up the bank, they saw 2 or 3 Indians disappearing in the distance. Pipe in hand, Clark entered the low door of the first lodge. A group of perhaps 30 short, stocky figures were crowded against the opposite wall, their black eyes filled with terror. Several children were crying, and wild-eyed squaws were wringing their hands. He had never seen such fear. The captain stepped forward smiling and took each Indian by the hand. He took some pieces of bright ribbon from his pocket and gave them to the squaws. As this seemed to have a favorable effect, the white men sat down. Clark took out his burning glass, and as the hut had no roof, he focused a ray of light on the pipe bowl. When the tobacco caught fire, he took several puffs of smoke. Again, a wave of terror swept over the savages, and they drew back to the farthest corners. His efforts at friendship had failed. When he visited in the other huts, none of the Indians came forward to take the peace pipe from his outstretched hand. At this point, the main party arrived on the scene. The 2 Choponish chiefs explained the peaceful intentions of the party to the frightened Indians and pointed to Sacagawea with her baby. This assured the Indians that all was well, as they knew no war party ever took along women and babies. Everyone joined in the sign talk pantomime. Sacagawea told Clark that the Indians believed the strangers were gods who had fallen from the sky. The Indians said they knew this because they had seen it happen with their own eyes. They had heard a report of thunder, had seen the white crane fall from the clouds, and there before them stood the white god who brought fire from heaven to light his pipe. Twisted Hair explained the object of the expedition and persuaded the tribe that the white strangers were only mortals who ate dogs, danced delightfully, and gave presents of gay ribbons and mirrors. The Indians then provided a supper of fish and roots. The peace pipe went around and the white men continued on their way. These practical Americans knew where they were going, and with their rifles and axes they were going to get there in the shortest time possible. They were unconcerned with the meaning of savage superstitions. But in the ancient wisdom of the Indian there existed an unseen reality and power behind all things. It was the Great Spirit who had given life to all his creatures and gave them brethren. They saw his image in the beauty of lake and mountain and heard his voice in the wind and rain. He spoke to their wise men in dreams and visions. He heard their prayers and answered when they danced the tribal dances for rain and harvest and victory over their enemies. Nearing the great falls of the Columbia, the canoes passed under high black cliffs towering into fantastic shapes. Down their sheer faces, waterfalls spouted in long feathery banners of spray and mist. At the falls, the great river poured over a 20-foot ledge. The canoes were unloaded, and with the help of the Indians and their horses, the boats and the luggage were portaged around the falls and again put in the water. With long ropes of elk skin, the canoes were eased down another drop of 8 feet. At a place where the Indians had recently camped, the men made a new acquaintance, a multitude of fleas. These sagacious animals were so pleased to exchange the straw and fish skins in which they had been living for some better residence that we were soon covered with them, and during the portage the men were obliged to strip to the skin in order to brush them from their bodies. These ferocious guests plagued the corpse during their entire stay among the Western Indians. Below the falls, the river opened out into a large basin. Here, directly across the river, rose a high black rock that seemed to block the channel completely. Clark climbed to the top and peered over. Far below, they could see the river boiling through a rocky gorge. There was nothing for it but to shoot this narrow passage. The 5 canoes raced safely through, while the astonished Indians looked on from the top of the rock. Below this were more rapids, even worse. The non-swimmers got out and toted the valuables, while Cruzat lashed the canoes in pairs and took them safely through the raging waters. Next day, they found that they would have to shoot another rapid that raced between high cliffs through a 3-mile chasm in which the water boils and swells in a tremendous manner. Again, the valuables were portaged, and one after another the 5 canoes shot through the wild rush of water. After shooting these narrows, the party made camp on a high cliff which they called Fort Rock. The men repaired the canoes, picked off fleas, and entertained the visiting Indians with a dance to the violin. In the distance, the white cone of Mount Hood rose into the blue-green sky. At this point, the 2 Chupanush chiefs, Tito and Twisted Hair, left the party and returned upriver on horseback. Captain Clark went downstream to explore the next cascade between them and Tidewater. The riverbed was filled with huge rocks that might have been flung down by the angry gods of the mountains at the beginning of the world. Over these the river raced in rushing waves and whirlpools. Again there was the weary task of carrying the baggage over the slippery rocks and easing the empty canoes down the foaming cascades by means of poles. After 2 days of hard labor, they finally reloaded and rowed out on the placid surface of the river that now flowed untroubled to the sea. The weary captains wrote, "The rapid we have just passed is the last of all the descents of the Columbia to the sea, November 2nd to December 8th, 1805. As the 5 canoes glided down the widening river, they passed a perpendicular rock that rose 800 feet above the water. They called this landmark Beacon Rock. Game was now plentiful along the wooded shore, where the Skillet villagers came out to trade Wapatu roots for fish hooks.